EBRD'nin Londra'daki yıllık konferansında önemli bir panel sonrası önemli bir ekonomistle buluşuyoruz. Jim O'Neill'la birlikteyiz. Kendisi Goldman Sachs'ın eski baş ekonomisti ve BRICS kavramının da yaratıcısı. Şu anda da halen Birleşik Krallık Lordlar Kamerası'nda bağımsız üye. Mr. O'Neill, thanks for joining our program.
My pleasure.
Actually, we have been passed through a volatile 5 months. If you look at these 5 months, when you look at the balance sheet, what do you think is the headline for these 5 months?
Chaos.
Cal. We have heard lots of Trumponomics in the panel.
Yeah.
How do you evaluate this 5 months?
You know, if one tries to look through it or above it, maybe there is some kind of method to the madness. If it results in other really big economies, for example, China, and in Europe, Germany, expanding their own domestic levels of growth more, then that's much better for the rest of the world. A key feature at this event, given who the EBRD's members are, is obviously Germany, because Germany is so big relative to everybody else in Europe. If Germany grew more itself, not only would that probably help German politics to be more stable, but it would also help Germany import more from other countries and be very good for the region. And in some ways, I see that's behind what America is complaining about, and the same with China on a much bigger scale. So if you look 5 weeks on from so-called Liberation Day, it looks like Germany and China are going to do more about their own economies than might have been the case otherwise. So that is one of the few positive things to take away from all this chaos. Obviously, there are still enormous uncertainties, and we don't know what Trump will say next week about.
Now there have eased the tariffs, and after 90 days, we don't know what will happen.
Yeah.
What do you expect?
Well, I think the markets have come to the conclusion that Trump doesn't like markets being negative about him. And if that's true, then effectively the markets think they've got him under control. Now, that is a pretty dangerous conclusion because Trump seems to have very erratic ways. But it does seem that when he's influenced by the combination of markets and big business people complaining to him about the damage, then he rose back. So today, I think there's a belief that, yes, it's only 90 days, but if there's no deal at the end of 90 days, there'll be another extension until there is a deal.
So he won't let the markets go down?
I think I'm reluctant to say definitely that that's the case because markets go up and down. And there's other reasons why markets could go down. But I think that's a reasonable assumption today.
So do you think we are in the middle of this trade war, and who will be the winner and who will be the loser of this trade war?
There's no winners of trade wars. One of the few things I've learned in 40-odd years of thinking about these things is that there are internal losers and internal winners in any country, but global trade helps everybody. You know, I'm best known as the brick guy.
Yeah, you're the creator of
I'm the creator of bricks. And in the 24 years since that happened, we have taken hundreds of millions of people, hundreds of millions, out of global poverty. And that's because of more trade involving China and India, Turkey, Middle East, everywhere. And so everybody's a winner. It might well be that domestic policies in some countries haven't dealt with the consequences of more trade. And hopefully another thing that will come from this, and I'm heavily involved in this in the UK, is better domestic policies to make sure more people win in your own country from trade. But the world as a whole is the only winner from global trade. And if we have, so it's not like country wins versus country X. No, neither does.
How do you think Turkey might get affected from this trade war?
I often think for Turkey, given how Turkey runs a persistent current account deficit, and so it depends on a lot of foreign capital, the most important thing for Turkey from this in the near term is that we don't have a huge rise in US interest rates. Because if that was the case, it would make it less likely that capital would go into Turkish investments. And that's the best thing for Turkey in the next few months. Over the longer term, as always, Turkey has to think about its own domestic reforms and what it can control. You know, Turkey's by European standards, a very large populated country. And so if it can deregulate more and have rising productivity, Turkey can control a lot of its own destiny and not be so influenced by things that are hitting it from the rest of the world. And that, if I were running Turkey, that's what I'd be doing.
So sometimes we also talk about the T BRICS, as you are the creator of BRICS.
Yeah.
Do you ever think that Turkey might be a part of BRICS Plus that you have called in the panel?
Yeah.
Or Turkey should be a part of Europe?
You know, Turkey should do whatever's best for Turkey. And one of the other interesting things that has happened about the past 15 years and has increased over the past 5 is there are some countries around the world that haven't gone into the BRICS group or the G7 group and just do their thing and try to have a good relationship with both. And in some ways, Turkey, through its own sort of volatile way, is kind of doing that. And I think that's not a bad strategy for Turkey. I think it's, especially during this era of strong personalities of President Xi and President Trump, I think there's a danger of I'm going to be in that camp or I'm going to be in this camp. You know, be in your own camp and do what's right for you. And I think that's probably the right way for Turkey.
So for the global economy, do you see any hard landing? Because we have seen that the growth prospects have been lowered.
Yeah.
How serious the slowdown for global economy?
You know, I change my mind about this every week at the moment because there's so many uncertainties. But if you look at how things are as we come to the middle of May, so a month and a half after so-called Liberation Day, things don't seem as bad as they might have been. I mean, it's partly because of this interplay with interest rates and market expectations about oil prices and inflation. It feels to me that we're getting through this enormous shock to the status quo that Trump has thrown in better than I would have thought. So and especially because I emphasize again, we've got Germany and China, 2 really big parts of the world economy, starting to think about stimulating their own economies. And that's a pretty good thing for more growth and more balanced growth around the world.
And Germany and Europe is very important as our biggest trading partner.
Of course.
What do you expect in terms of European growth and Germany growth and euro-dollar parity?
So I think the current pessimism about European growth is probably a bit overdone.
The worst is over?
I don't know about the worst being over, but I think the mood can't get any worse relative to what is likely. You asked me about the euro-dollar exchange rate.
Euro-dollar. Do you think euro can keep its strength?
I think another part of all of this is that the obsession with US exceptionalism, as market participants were calling it, and the strength of the dollar is behind us. And I'm being careful because I spent far too much of my life in the foreign exchange market, and the only thing I know is everybody gets it wrong. With that caveat, I think the dollar's going to be weaker later this year. So I think the euro will strengthen further.
It will stay over 110.
I think there's a good chance it'll get over 115 in the latter part of the year.
Okay. So how closely are you following Turkey right now? For example, Mehmet Şimşek will be here tomorrow. Are you going to have a meeting with him?
I didn't know that, and I've not been invited, so that tells you everything.
Okay.
There was a day where I might have been.
Do you ever have questions about Turkey investment opportunities and other things?
You know, when I again stand back, as you will remember, after about 12 years ago when I left Goldman Sachs, and I was doing various things, there was all this focus on what it wasn't me, people thought it was me, called them the mint countries, of Turkey being one of them. And I did this radio program where I traveled to them all, including Turkey for a while. And it was amazing to me to be there and to meet big Turkish companies and to focus on all the very diverse neighbors that Turkey had, whether it's the Middle East to its south, obviously Russia to the north, and then Europe to the west. And that made me think that if Turkey could find a better path of stability on its domestic policies, Turkey's got a pretty bright future.
Okay. Lastly, do you have anything in mind to cover as a coin, as a phrase, apart from BRICS, in the coming years?
The whole thing about the mints where I would wake up one day and read stories that I was creating acronyms that I hadn't created. That taught me there's only one acronym that I really created, and it's
the
BRICS.
And
So
that's the only one.
I'm not going to try and create any more.
Okay, Mr. O'Neill, thanks for joining our
All
program.
right, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.